Well, I see there's a considerable appetite for more on the North Korean nuclear threat today. And that's good from my point of view. My name is Joshua Pollack. I'm from Science Applications International Corporation in McLean, Virginia, in the United States. I've been asked to both chair and speak at this panel, so I will very briefly introduce the speakers. I would like, of course, to thank Dr. Han Chae-bong and the Asan Institute for organizing this panel and inviting us. I think, naturally, it's very timely. The strength of this panel, I believe, is its diversity of nationalities, methodological approaches, and general perspectives. We have Professor Kim Young-ho from Yonsei University here in Seoul, who brings analysis from international relations theory to the challenges of security on the Korean Peninsula and in the region, and creatively weaves together theoretical constructs with the empirical realities. Dr. Markus Schiller of Schmucker Technology in Munich, Germany, possibly the only astronautical engineer present today, deeply versed in ballistic missile technology and already well known and appreciated in the proliferation tracking community for the skeptical intelligence that he has brought to understanding North Korean missile capabilities. And Mr. Joel Witt of the Johns Hopkins University SAIS, School for Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., a true scholar diplomat. I would venture that Joel has spent more time on the ground in North Korea or interacting with North Korean interlocutors in various settings than any other individual here today. It's just a guess, but I wouldn't be surprised, and I think we disregard his perspectives at our peril. For those of you who don't know me and my work, I work in the defense policy and strategy field, specializing in deterrence and nonproliferation. I try to bring together insights from different fields in my work, and I hope that's what we'll be able to do collectively today. With that, I will hand it over to Professor Kim Young-ho. We will, just one last word, we will try to hold our remarks to just a few minutes each so we can have something of a conversation and interact. Professor Kim?
Thank you. I want to join the majority people who evaluated very pessimistically about North Korean nuclear issue. I want to state that North Korea will not abandon its nuclear program. To Kim Jong-un, nothing is more important than his political survival. So to Kim Jong-un, his own political survival is prioritized to economic development or even the survival of the North Korea as a state. That is why economic sanction or economic package in return for abandonment of North Korean nuclear project fail to elicit North Korea's concession. And nowadays, I'm focusing on the potential North Korea's connection with Iran. Already, U.S. Secretary of State Kelly expressed his concern over North Korea's Iranian connection. And recent Iran declared its success in bringing back Monkey from its space trip. The photo, there's rumor that it's fabricated, and they declare different monkeys, and the color of hair is different. But anyway, it is a fact that they are doing some experiment to bringing back monkey from the stratosphere into the atmosphere. That means they try to acquire basic element, basic material, and basic technique to protect the warhead when it re-enters into the atmosphere. So if that technique is being transferred to North Korea, that signifies North Korea acquire all core element and technique to manufacture ICBM with nuclear warhead. So that is why the situation after the third North Korean nuclear test is more serious than before. It was in 1994 that I submitted a paper to the Ministry of Unification titled Setting Up North Korea Policy with the Assumption of de facto Possession of Nuclear Weapon by North Korea. It was in 1994, so it's some 19 years ago. So although it was written in Korean, for those who are interested, You can refer that paper. In that paper, there was no nuclear test of North Korea and no information available about what's going on inside North Korea. So my choice was to conduct a comparative analysis of previous nuclearized states, such as South Africa, Israel, India, Pakistan, and Sweden. And I concluded that North Korea already took the path of the previous nuclearized states. So I concluded that, well, they're going to nuclearize in the near future. So the comparative study now signifies several solutions. In South Africa, there was regime change. One of the earliest accomplishment of Mandela government was to, in front of public, cut the undeclared bomb into two pieces. Well, in case of North Korea, however, regime change accompanied high degree of uncertainty, and more important, the uncertain usage of nuclear weapon by unidentified group of elites, whoever they are. So this will be very bring about a high degree of uncertainty. However, we can get some implication from the Swedish case. Sweden calculated that the nuclearization was a far cheaper option than strengthening its conventional air force capability. But in the middle of nuclearization, Sweden realized that several Swedish cities are included in the list of targets by Soviet nuclear weapons. So in this case, nuclear weapon that was meant to protect Swedish security become the very source of threat to Swedish security. So what we are concerning is to manufacture a certain situation in which North Korean nuclear weapon, rather than protecting its security, become the source of threat. The verbal exchange between North Korea on the one hand and United States and South Korea on the other hand sounds just like a debate between earning and losing. South Korean warning message and U.S. warning message to North Korean provocative behavior, all is contained these words. There is nothing, there is anything, there is little North Korea can earn by conducting the nuclear test or missile test. The North Korea's counter response is that if you put any sort of sanction on North Korea that will be regarded as an act of war, then you will experience a great loss. So it's a debate between earning and loss. In international relations literature, it is a well-known fact that states are more sensitive to losing than to earning. Okay, there is nothing to earn for North Korea by conducting nuclear tests. However, if there is nothing to lose, then they will keep on doing nuclearization. So we should convince North Korea that by conducting nuclear test or missile test, you have something to lose. Then we have to, we have to set up a contingency theory that if, in case of misuse of nuclear weapon to South Korea, then Kim Jong-un, not North Korea, Kim Jong-un will face the same fate as given by Osama bin Laden. And we require some sort of countermeasures, such as the deployment of F-22 Raptor, which are the most threatening weapon to Kim Jong-un's political survival. Otherwise, there's no option for South Korea to go nuclear. And there's a hot debate going on about the gaining recycling and reprocessing capability for South Korea. However, there's two interconnected barriers of domestic consensus and risk-taking about how to solve North Korea's nuclear question. The Sunshine Policy failed to draw domestic consensus over how many years do we need or how much resources do we have to put on North Korea to change North Korean behavior. They failed to do so. And in this case, we don't have any domestic consensus of how resolute we can be in dealing with North Korean nuclear issue and how further to go for nuclear. In Jeju Island, there is some political activists and environmentalists held demonstration to protect the environment and oppose the government idea of building the naval base in Jeju Island. And also there are some NGOs opposing South Korean use of atomic energy. So in this situation, going nuclear is also a very difficult option for South Korea. So what I'm arguing is there will be some convincible measure to convince North Korea's leader that there is something to lose. That'll be all. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Marcus Schiller to speak, and once the four of us have gone through, we can have a conversation.
Thank
Please,
you.
Marcus, go right ahead.
As Josh already mentioned, I'm an engineer by training and not a political scientist. And I am specializing in rocketry and missiles, and so I want to share some of my thoughts and findings of the December launch of the UNHA-3 review. What I noticed during the past weeks regarding the debate on the UNHA-3 was, first of all, there were a lot of opinions voiced in the media that were under the baseline of now UNHA-3 long-range missile, the UNHA-3 long-range missile is ready. That was the baseline of the mass media reports that I read. There were only some minor discussions about the range and the exact payload mass of this missile and what was to do to stop North Korea's continuous progress in missile capabilities. But I would propose a different approach to the whole issue. I would say that threat is a product of intention and capability, and if one of these factors is zero, the threat is zero. So if you don't have an intention to attack, there's no threat. The same as if the capability is very low, the threat can't be very high. As we heard during the first session, we don't have any clue about the real intentions of North Korea. But we have a unique chance now with the successful launch and the recovery of some debris of the missile or the rocket, let's call it rocket from here on. We can now learn a lot about the capabilities of North Korea. And after scrutinizing the UNHA-3 launch, we should draw conclusions on the intentions, because we can try to figure out some of the intentions when we see what the capabilities were that they were working on. And after we have an idea about the capabilities and the intentions, we can think of the threat and of adequate responses. That means there are several very important questions that we should look into. And the first and most important question of all is, was the UNHA-3 designed as a weapon or as a space launcher? That's the primary design role, and we also have to think about the potential for conversion from one role to the other. But to give you an idea why this is so important, if you are building a fleet of cargo aircraft, you can, of course, deliver bombs with those aircraft, but it's very difficult to win a war with them. They can serve as a deterrence, but not as a serious threat. But if you would tell me that you are building and deploying a long-range bomber fleet to challenge the business case of FedEx or UPS, I would seriously doubt your intentions. So we should look into the capabilities that were revealed by the launch, the technology that was applied, the performance of the rocket, the pace of the program. We should look at the whole package. And we should think, what does that mean for the past and for the future capabilities? What does it tell us about the past capabilities of North Korea in the missile arena? And what else can we expect in the near and in the far future? And last but not least, what does all that mean in the political context? What does it mean for the North Korean foreign policy? What does it mean for its domestic policy? What does it mean for the Republic of Korea, for the US and its allies, for their foreign policy, but also for the defense policy? So let's have a short look at the technical analysis and the results. We now have a very good knowledge of the first stage of this three-stage rocket. We have some insights on the second stage, and we have some ideas about the third stage. We know the first stage propellant, the engines, we know the design approach, the applied technologies, we know which burn times they had, we know the thrust levels, the guidance and control system, we have an idea about the trajectory. We know something about the second stage propellants that were used, but as I said, I won't go into the technical details right now, we can do that later in the discussion. We know that the mission was successful, that's a very important data point. The only surprise were the little control engines in the first stage, but everything else on this rocket was as predicted, the aluminum airframe, the Scud technology, the propellants, even though we have some interesting ideas about the propellants, but as I said, we'll do that later. We have some medium confidence information about the trajectory, about the burn time of the stages, the velocity profile, and so on, and adding all that together, we now have a consistent model of the rocket that duplicates the trajectory. The North Koreans were kind enough to show us some pictures out of the control room, out of the mission control room. We don't know if that what they were showing was really the real deal. It seems that it was a stage presentation, but we have to go with that for now. And adding all that together, there were some surprises in the package. We have a very low thrust second stage that's quite heavy, and we have a high performance third stage. I want to translate that into the findings. With a 700 kilogram warhead, this whole stack with the 3 stages would offer a range perhaps of more than 8,000 kilometers. So it's quite capable. But, very interesting, with the low thrust in the second stage, it is only sensible for small satellites. If we put a different engine in the second stage, one of the engines that they already have available, for example in the dome engine, that would offer us at least 1,000 kilometers more of range. So if they would have been going for range, they would have used a different engine. The whole stack was designed as a satellite launcher. The production quality was not the best. First stage airframe was, well, okay. Some parts were imported. But this hints on prototyping at the moment, not serial production. So as a consequence, I don't think that we have to change our previous assessments. They still have a long road to go for a serious threat. This is more of a political signal, domestic as well as external. It is an old program. They started this program in the 1990s, perhaps even in the late 1980s, and now they had that success. It is primarily to demonstrate progress to the North Korean people, in my view, and also to the world, show what the prosperous nation they are. To the US, to the Republic of Korea and its allies, I would say it's not that big a deal. It's kind of a political tool, but it's not a direct threat at the moment. Singular events can always happen, but they could also direct an aircraft into a building or something like that. If they want to do a terror attack, they can't do that for a long time. But we should remain vigilant and continue close observations and see if anything changes. And when it changes, we have to be very careful and look closely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up with my own presentation at this point, and then we will conclude with Joel. As I think is apparent from Marcus's remarks, there is an enduring controversy over the nature of North Korea's rocket program, also of their nuclear missile programs. And I think this goes back to their first launch of a multi-stage rocket back in August of 1998. Between August of 1998 and their fourth attempt to put to get a multi-stage rocket into space, they had in April of last year, they had never experienced a complete success, either partial or complete failures. But the North Korean regime labeled all of these successes. Finally, they achieved a success on the 5th try in December of last year. And I would argue that in some respects, the nuclear program has followed a similar trajectory. In their first test in October 2006, they got a result that was judged a partial failure in the United States, whereas the North Koreans themselves called it a success. And that's the first time of which I'm aware that a country's first nuclear test did not achieve a success. The second test, in May of 2009, appeared more successful, but it was unusually low in yield for an early nuclear device. The third test on February 12th was more in line with what we would expect from a country's early series of tests in terms of yield. It was described by the North Koreans as being smaller and light, meaning, well, they're suggesting that they could weaponize it. So I'd like to ask, what could explain this unusual developmental pattern, where we see just a handful of tests separated by years, typically, and with a fairly high number of failures? And how is it that we're now seeing successes, and why? I'd like to suggest that this overall pattern over 15 plus years reflects what we could call a stepping stone approach to development. We heard earlier about the fable of the frog and the scorpion. Well, in this case, perhaps the scorpion is trying to get across the river on its own. But in their attempt to cross this metaphorical river of technology development, you could say the North Koreans are not going to the trouble of building a bridge. Instead, they're trying to skip from one small stone to the next, with using as few resources as possible, very unusually so. And now, in the form of the December space launch, they've achieved their first success. I would say there are two reasons for that. First, the program has gradually matured. They've been at this for a long time, and other countries, I think, have had similar experiences, but maybe not on the same timetable. Second, there's been a change in leadership. In contrast to Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un has expressed different attitudes and expectations about technology development. So let's take a closer look at the record of failures. Every few years, until last year, the North Koreans would, when they launched two, the North Koreans would launch a rocket. In 3 out of 4 cases through April 2012, they've made photographs or video available. And we can see from those 3 cases that each launch involved a significantly different rocket. None succeeded, of course, until recently. In April 2012, they finally broke the pattern of claiming success. The official media quickly acknowledged that the Unha-3 rocket had failed. North Korea then returned later that same year and conducted a successful launch. So we had 3 surprises last year: admission of failure, retesting of a largely similar, not identical, but largely similar rocket in the same year, and success. I would conclude that, again, the first piece of the puzzle is technological maturation. As Marcus pointed out, we appear to be looking at a prototype, but it appears to be now a largely finalized prototype for reaching low Earth orbit. They may move on to new models for more ambitious tasks. But why the admission of failure? Under Kim Jong-il, appearances sometimes counted for as much as reality. The official media portrayed the failed space launches and the somewhat failed nuclear tests as the triumphs of an infallible leader. In the case of the space launches, there are even commemorative stamps that you can purchase if you ever visit Pyongyang. After the failed launch of April 2009, the official newspaper of the Workers' Party of Korea boasted that the space programs of the United States and Japan and the United Kingdom had these strings of early failures, but no, North Korea alone can succeed on the first try. Well, this rhetoric may have suited the mentality of Kim Jong-il, who was well known for his appreciation of cinema and stagecraft. But now, of course, they've departed from this approach under the new leader. by admitting failure. I think it is noticeable here how differently the April and December launches were handled. In April, the international media was brought in. It was a big production, lots of publicity, both domestically and abroad. They clearly were confident of success, and Kim Jong-un may have learned a valuable lesson from the failure. The December launch was entirely different. There was no media access, and in fact, the launch was not publicized in advance of the event inside of North Korea. That suggests two things. First, they understood the potential for failure. Second, they did not desire to mislead the public as had been done under Kim Jong-il. If they experienced a failure, they would have the option of not saying anything to their public if they wanted. Furthermore, just prior to the December launch, there was an announcement made to the outside world that a technical problem had been detected that might delay the launch. Now, admitting fallibility suggests a certain distancing from the false certainties of the past, a movement towards more realistic expectations. We could even say standards of professionalism, perhaps. One official of the Korean Committee on Space Technology immediately afterwards wrote that Kim Jong-un had told them, "We should not lose heart at a failure, and a man grows on rice, and science rises up in failures." So this attitude towards trial and error is very different from the miraculous and illusory triumphs of the Kim Jong-il era. And this brings us to today. Now, it's well understood that North Korea's rocket technology is based on Soviet models and perhaps Soviet inputs, although there's a debate on how much is what and how much is the other. But I believe we may have overlooked a different sort of input, and that is their development model. The stepping stone model, of moving from one prototype to another without doing mass production, without trying to perfect something, I believe is an adaptation of something practiced in the past by the Chinese. In the 1960s, the Chinese government settled upon a comprehensive plan for a series of progressively longer-range liquid-fueled missiles that would lead them to ICBMs. Initially, I think they aimed at the mid to late 70s. They actually achieved that milestone in the early 80s. But now North Korea has taken this idea to the furthest possible extreme by building a single prototype, testing it, not ironing out the bugs, but simply moving on to the next one. You could call this the North Korean-style stepping stone approach. It's low resource, it's high risk, but now the North Koreans seem to believe that they can cross the Pacific with it. That's what they're telling us. Joel, if you're ready.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Pardon me, my voice is coming and going, so if all of a sudden I open my mouth and nothing comes out, you'll understand why. There are a couple of points here. First, just a factual point that I'm sure my colleagues are aware of, but the fact is that North Korea had a moratorium on long-range missile tests that lasted 7 years. So when you look at the length of this development effort, you definitely have to factor that into whatever your calculations are. Secondly, I hate to say, but most of the people this morning stole my thunder because for those of you who've heard me talk before, you will know that I and others have been saying for a number of years now that North Korea is on its way to becoming a small nuclear power. And it's been emerging very slowly, transitioning very slowly from having maybe some material and a few bombs in the basement to becoming an outright nuclear power. And the recent test, of course, has now started this chorus of people saying, yes, indeed, that's what's happening. So what I'd like to do is try to look a little bit further into the future But first, I wanted to just whet your appetites a little bit by these handouts, which are the most recent satellite photos of the nuclear test site after the recent test. And what they show, first of all, is that a day after the test, there was no activity and it was snow covered. 2 days later, there's a lot of activity. The grounds have been cleared, the roads have been cleared, there are paths created by people. So there's something going on there. That doesn't mean they're going to conduct another test, but there's new activity there. Secondly, one of the pictures will show you an area where there has been, there's a new cleared area, which we've identified in the past few months. And we don't know what that is, but one possibility is they're starting to dig another tunnel, and that will take them a couple of years. So the point here is there's a lot of momentum behind this program, and you know, my background is different from my my colleagues up here. I'm not an academic, I'm not a scientist. I've been a policymaker in the US government for 15 years, and so that's my approach here. And my approach tells me, my gut tells me that there's momentum behind this program, that the North Koreans are serious about developing these weapons, and that this is a problem for us. So in looking into the future, I think there's enough information out there to try to start making some projections. For example, one prominent American recently released some projections that with a worst-case analysis, North Korea could have 50 nuclear weapons by 2016. I know there are other worst-case analyses floating around Washington that have them with 25 nuclear weapons already, and the number is going to grow. There are going to be more nuclear tests, and also the Yunha missile, which my colleagues are talking about, it's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we see evidence at their test sites of construction activities for much larger missiles. Doesn't mean it's going to proceed smoothly, just gives you an idea of what the future intentions are here. Also, there are a lot of uncertainties, there's no doubt about it, and I think, you know, we've heard some of the people up here talk about those uncertainties. But if you're a policymaker thinking about where you want to go in the future, it's good to listen to everyone and their views. But I think the overall conclusion here is that where there's smoke, there's fire. So something is going on here. Secondly, once again, if you're a policymaker looking into the future, and we've heard some of this morning, so I apologize if I'm repeating some of it, there are very clear implications here for the United States, for the region, and for the international community. As I said, we've heard some of these this morning. I've come up in the past with 9 sobering implications, and they start with, of course, the direct threat to our allies and the region, and a long-term threat to the United States. There's a growing technical capability and confidence to sell weapons and technology abroad without fear of reprisal, and that lack of fear comes from your growing nuclear capabilities. Third, there's the ability to threaten and coerce neighbors, such as South Korea. And there's also linked to that an increasing danger of conflict. And this is something I found very disturbing recently. I fully believe that we need to take measures to strengthen our defenses, to deal with this growing threat. But in doing that, we have to be very careful. We have to think about what we're doing and what the implications are. For example, if South Korea acquires the capability to launch a preventive attack or to decapitate the North Korean leadership, does that bolster deterrence or does it create instability? I think that's an important issue here that people aren't focused on. There are other implications here. What about U.S. South Korean defense plans for defending the peninsula against the North Korean attack. If North Korea, for example, 5 years from now, starts building tactical nuclear weapons like Pakistan, will that affect our plans to defend the peninsula? The answer is, of course, yes. Another thing going on here, look down the road. What's going on with the U.S. defense budget? Well, there are a lot of pressures to cut the U.S. defense budget. Well, if you have pressures to cut the U.S. defense budget and you have an escalating North Korean threat, where are those two lines going to meet, and what are going to be the implications for our alliance on the peninsula and indeed for our alliance with Japan? Another possibility here, everyone has been concerned or fixated, I should say, in the past few years about the danger of instability in North Korea. Well, what happens if 5 years from now it is unstable? And you have a North Korea with 50, 60, 70 nuclear weapons, and it's unstable. That's a worse situation than we're in today, of course. There are a couple other of these implications, but these are the kinds of things that people are only now starting to think about and really haven't thought about in the past. Third point here, what should we do about it? Well, you know, I've sat through discussions of North Korea for 20 years, and it seems to me they oscillate from one extreme to the other. It's either A, people ask these theological questions about North Korean intentions, and the debate goes on and on and on forever without, of course, any answers, because no one really knows. Or B, people are certain about North Korean intentions, and that structures how they think about this problem. As someone who's been doing this for a long time, yes, I have my own views, but I am willing to admit that none of us here can predict the future. None of us here know with certainty about North Korean intentions in the future. And that gets to the point that Ambassador Gallucci made this morning, that as a realist, you need empirical data upon which to base a policy. So what should the policy be? Well, I think, the first thing we need to do is get out of our minds all these myths that we have about North Korea, that it's an isolated, failing country led by crazy dictators clinging to nuclear weapons for their survival. That's not true. It's not isolated. It's not a failing regime. Its leaders aren't crazy, and indeed, they are realists. They're realists who are skilled at maneuvering between big powers and others. Secondly, we need to break out of this death spiral we're in. We're always reacting to bad North Korean behavior, and then we don't do anything afterwards. There's a lull, and then there's more bad behavior, and we react to it. That's not a long-term strategy. So the first thing we need to do here is the U.S. needs to seriously think about its policy towards North Korea, and it needs to re-examine the current approach and look at alternatives. I would characterize the current approach as weak sanctions and weak diplomacy and leading from behind. What we need is strong sanctions, strong diplomacy, with the U.S. playing a leading role here. Sanctions are important, there's no doubt about it, but they are never going to be enough in and of themselves to solve this policy. Military measures are important, but once again, never in and of themselves enough to solve this problem. The last point here, and Ambassador Gallucci made this morning, we need realistic short-term goals. North Korea is not going to denuclearize overnight. It's going to be a long-term process. We need to identify steps moving down that path without implicitly accepting North Korea as a nuclear state. Why don't I stop here because I don't have much time, but I do want to make one last point. So many times I hear this discussion characterized as engagement versus not engaging. That's not what we have here. We need to do both. And people need to understand that diplomacy is not only to reach agreements That's not the sole purpose of diplomacy. Diplomacy in this case plays a number of different roles. First, it provides you with clarity about North Korean intentions as opposed to, reaching conclusions about it without talking to them, without trying to figure it out. Secondly, you can get agreements. It provides escape routes to interact with sanctions and military measures. And lastly, it helps build diplomatic coalitions. And I'm not talking about building a diplomatic coalition with the United States, South Korea, and Japan. I'm talking about building a diplomatic coalition with China. Diplomacy can play an important role there if we do it right. I'll stop.
Thank you, Joe. I'd like to start the conversation by posing a question to Professor Kim and to Mr. Witt that plays off a certain commonality or contrast in their remarks. Kim, you had suggested that to deter North Korea's nuclear development, we need to threaten the regime itself because that's what they value. And Joel, you had mentioned precision strike capabilities that the South Koreans are developing and asked, does that contribute to deterrence or does it spark instability? I'd like to look at these related questions through the lens of something I learned from Thomas Schelling, who knows a thing or two about deterrence. I shouldn't bury him before his time, I'm sorry. He wrote that to deter an adversary, you also need to exhibit restraint. If you are making a conditional promise of punishment, you have to be able to credibly promise that you will not apply it if they meet certain conditions or do not violate certain lines. And I wonder if our current military posture and developments in the South Korean military posture are not sending that message of conditional restraint that would give them something to lose. Would you care to react to that?
My point of view is that North Korea always start by doing what it's not supposed to do. And then in return for undoing what it's not supposed to do, they request concessions from South Korea and United States. So what I argued was not just the hawkish policy toward North Korea. Hawkish or dovish is up to the decision maker. However, either hawkish or the dovish policy should be directed to the survival of Kim Jong-un, not the economic condition of North Korea overall, because that's what Kim Jong-un valued. That's why I talk about the F-117 stealth bombers, because during the process of six-party talks, there were about 4 occasions of deployment of F-117 in the middle of negotiation, and less than 1 month of deployment, North Korea changed its attitude from uncooperative to cooperative. It was in 2003, 2004, 2005, and 2007. So maybe it can be labeled as coincidence. However, with that, we could test North Korea's risk-taking willingness. Under the Kim Jong-il regime, I don't think they have a strong will of risk-taking. However, there's no empirical data about Kim Jong-un, so it's a good chance to test their risk-taking will, whether they really want confrontation or not by just mere measure of deployment F-22 Raptor or something like that.
I'm sorry, I don't really know what to say in response to that because I'm glad my colleague is sure that those moves by the United States changed North Korean behavior, but I have no evidence to suggest that at all. And so I just don't know what to say in response to that. Secondly, in response to Look, it is a fine line. I mean, we had the same problem when we were dealing with the Soviet Union, counterforce versus countervalue, decapitation versus not decapitation. I don't know the answer to that. All I know is that it's very clear to me that the trends are in place that could create serious instability on the peninsula. And I'm not excusing North Korean behavior from that at all. They're precipitating this. But the trends are in place in South Korea to acquire preventive strike capabilities, including decapitation. On top of that, in 2010, we now know that President Lee was inclined to order a military response to the artillery attack. He said so himself publicly and was restrained from doing that. I suspect that crisis came a lot closer to escalation than any of us know. I know U.S. government officials had many sleepless nights during those days because of what was going on. So we need to be very careful here. This is not an academic discussion. This is the real world.
If I can jump in with some thoughts on this, I think there may be some evidence, I read Professor Kim's work on this subject, that the F-117 deployments were timed to certain stances that the North Koreans took. We always have to make careful judgments about the difference between correlation and causation. But I also worry that that's, even if we do ascribe causative power to those moves, that's a short-term development. The long-term trends, Joel Waiters point out, are not terribly good. And I wonder if the repeated use of these threats isn't part of what's driving the North Koreans in that direction. Joel, would you respond to that?
I mean, there's a long history of this. It's not just recently. And once again, this is not to excuse North Korean behavior, but Peter Hayes could sit here probably for hours and talk about the history of U.S. nuclear threats that have been made since the 1950s against North Korea. They're there. That's history. I mean, we can't ignore it. I don't see it as an excuse, but we can't ignore the history. So, if you're a North Korean, there's some justification for the route they're taking today, although I will say that, I once again respectfully disagree with Professor Kim's lumping together 20 years of history on this issue. In fact, it's gone through different phases. And so during the 1990s, we were in a phase, and Ambassador Endo knows this because he was there, we were in a phase where North Korea, being realists, was tacking towards a better relationship with the United States because its relationship with the Soviet Union had collapsed with the Soviet Union, and its relationship with China was having problems because China was improving relations with South Korea. North Korea moved towards improving relations with the United States, and the agreed framework was signed, and the agreed framework was a rousing success because North Korea was on the path to building maybe 75 to 100 nuclear weapons by the end of the decade. And it didn't do that. And it was because of the agreed framework. So there's a lot of history here that we have to understand if we want to be able to formulate policies that will serve us well in the future.
Professor Kim, did you want to add anything at this point, or should we?
I from time to time think about the six-party talks, and if were six-party talks a project of Samsung or some private enterprise, then this is a dead project. The six-party talk aimed to denuclearize North Korea, but it witnessed North Korean nuclear test, missile test, and now possession of nuclear weapon. So it is a dead project. If it's a company project, then the project dead, and the project leader will be fired. So there's nothing. That's what labeled as the lost 10 years is usually and unfruitful, ineffective diplomatic measure. So what is very important in this case, in this crisis management, crisis diplomacy, is to workable communication, what we want and what we do not want, and what they will lose and what they will earn. So in this case, they means Kim Jong-un.
If I can move the
I was
conversation.
about to agree with him on something.
Okay.
I agree. You know, we do need workable communication. You're absolutely right. We don't have that at all under the current circumstances. We read North Korean press reports. Our, government people make these boilerplate public announcements. That's not workable communication. And so that's one of the roles of diplomacy. It provides clarity. We send direct messages to the North Koreans. They send direct messages to us. Maybe something comes out of it. Maybe nothing comes out of it. But that's why diplomacy is important, or one reason.
I'd like to turn the conversation more towards the technical issues at this point. Marcus, you had said that the Yunha 3 appears optimized as a space launcher, and there are other choices that the North Koreans could have made to extend its range. They tend to be credited with their potential undemonstrated capabilities. And my question to you is, how far do you think policymakers should go in making assumptions about their potentials at this point, based on what we've seen? Should we rely strictly on flight tests, or what other body of data should we look at in considering what the threat potential is, especially when we think about these technologies in a missile mode? I say this in part because it's ingrained among defense planners to think in terms of worst-case scenarios. So we also can see risks to thinking in terms of worst-case scenarios. You can overreact. So my question is, what sort of inferences can we make? And if there's a range of inferences, can we express that?
Well, I can certainly agree with the approach that policymakers have to make worst-case scenarios, and also defense people have to assume worst-case scenarios. So in that case, you don't get any nasty surprises. But as we have heard already today, we should think of realities. We should base our politics on realities, because during the past decades, perhaps there was too much assuming worst-case scenarios, perhaps on both sides. And, well, long-range missile fleet, or even a short-range missile fleet, is a huge project. I can understand that defense planners and policymakers assume that North Korea is quite advanced in that area. But there are no miracles, and we are not in for any surprises in this area. Huge projects always take much longer than anticipated. They become more and more expensive. I can name you two good examples, even today, from Germany. When you look at the Berlin airport or a huge train station they're trying to build in Stuttgart that were tripling the prices and are now around $3 or $4 billion. Well, it's always a surprise. You always aim for a little program, and suddenly you encounter problems. And to smooth out these problems, test flights are the only way in the missile area. So test flights are very important and very, very good indication if something is a serious program or if it is just something that you try to do for the policy arena. So if we have reliable data about that, that gives a good idea about what we have to expect. And so, Josh, as you said, test flights would be a very good indication, but we can also still read a lot out of the handwriting, of the engineering handwriting that we can observe. Fact is that every high-tech product has something like a handwriting on it. You can see where it comes from, who was teaching these guys, what they are now applying. It is something that evolves over generations, you can say. And if we can figure out the traces of the North Korean programs, we can also know what to expect. And if we see something changes and you see some new ideas suddenly incorporated, You see that they are becoming more and more independent and that they are trying new approaches and trying to build something by themselves. So I would assume start looking much more at the capabilities, try to get as much information about that, and then base your policies on that. And be realistic about this. Always be careful not to be surprised in the future, but stay realistic.
Pat, I think we're ready to open the discussion to the floor. Yes.
Regarding the intentions, North Korean intentions, I think you need to pay attention to what Dr. Kim said. His 20 years long history of doing research on North Korean intentions. Why not friendly countries believe his research result? That has been said, clear about the North Korean intentions to build nuclear weapons.
Did you have a question, sir?
Having said that, regarding the capability, I think we were very satisfied with the Geneva Agreed Framework, and then we expected North Korea will comply with the Agreed Framework. After Agreed Framework, within North Korean political bureau, they said that they earned 7 years of time to relocate all the nuclear facilities outside of Yeongbyon. And they did that. And also freezing on plutonium, they began a highly enriched uranium program by importing Pakistani's enrichment facilities. And then, in addition to that, they began cooperation with Pakistan and Iran to develop missiles. They were in Pakistan in the testing of Gauri missiles, and also in Sahab-3 in Iran. Last year, Iran technicians came to North Korea to watch that, So they, after the agreed framework, they expanded the international cooperation to develop the missile capabilities and nuclear. So we didn't follow on very closely what they are doing on the international scene, just looking at North Korea. So they all avoided compliance with the already agreed framework or other things. So now we see the capabilities very developed. What could you say about the technology? In Germany, you estimated that the explosive power yield of this current nuclear test was 40 kiloton, very high end of the estimation. Well, how did you get that kind of a result from Germany? Can you explain something about that?
Thank you, sir. Anyone have a comment?
I'm sorry, for the rest of you here, I'm sure you've sat through these kinds of discussions before where people make assertions about history and then someone says, no, that's not what happened. And, I don't want to bore everyone with the history, but I will for a minute. And the point here is that we're old friends, so I feel I can say this to you. You're wrong on the plutonium program. Absolutely wrong. It was not relocated. Hey, imagine yourself as a North Korean, as a leader of a country, and you're reaching an agreement with someone else, and here you have a program where you're about to churn out maybe 100 nuclear weapons. You spent 10 years and maybe $100 billion building that program, and you reach an agreement with another country that basically trashes that program. You gut it. And then at the end of the 10 years or the 5 or 6 years you've had this agreement, you kind of say, well, gee, This agreement isn't working out. Now we're going to move to HEU. Our HEU program, where we have maybe 15 centrifuges, we've never put them all in we don't have the ability to build big cascades. We've never produced HEU. I think any leader who reaches that kind of agreement should be shot. I mean, he trashed a perfectly good program for one that they could never really know at that point whether it was going to work or not. So, you know, the way you're characterizing the history is just wrong.
How about the next question? Yes, sir.
저는 목사입니다. 북한 관계하는 목사인데 저는 한마디로 얘기해서 지금 우리나라는 큰 재앙에 빠졌다고 생각합니다. 저는 60년대에 공군본부에 있었는데
Please.
공군본부인데 그 당시 60년대 말에 그 정보국에 있는 데 보면은요 영변에서는 지금 그런 원자한다는 것이 일급 비밀이 있었습니다. 그러면 20년 전에 갈루지 대사가 여기 머물 때에 저는 갈루지 대사한테 당신네들이 북한이란 나라고 대충 이런 중간 선거 때문에 하면은 큰 재앙이 올 거라고 얘기할 때에 오늘도 갈루지 대사 말하지만 잘하겠다고 했어요. 그러도 미국이란 나라 우리나라에 엄청 은인임과 동시에 지금 북한은 죽기를 각오하고 핵무기를 가지라고 할 때 미국은요 대한민국 묶어놓고 있습니다. 그래서 모든 거 묶어놓고 하려고 하는데 미국이 간단합니다. 한국에 핵무기 만들게만 해놓으면은요 북한은 김정일이란 정권 김정은 정권이 자기 정권이 무너져 제일 무서워하기 때문에 합니다. 그러다 중국이란 나라가 북한을 활용하고 있고 미국이란 나라는요 한국 묶어놓고 있기 때문에 아닙니까? 한번 교수님께서는 대한민국이 핵무기를 만들겠다고 하는 것에 대해서 한번 말씀해주고 우리 그 죽고 사는 문제니까 한번 말씀해주면 감사하겠습니다. 예, 저는 북한 관계 목사하고 선교사입니다. 예.
Okay. I guess that's addressed to you, Professor.
Okay, I'm not in a position to confirm the government position, and but the issue is here that everybody thinking about the worst case. But in my view, worst case is not the possession of North Korea's possession of nuclear weapon. The worst case is North Korea's use of that weapon.
You know, I think some might say, or passing it on, as we heard earlier. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a whole different question just to Mr. Schiller, since this is a great opportunity. You said you think it's a low orbit satellite. I'm referring to the rocket in December. What does it take to turn that into a weapon? This question of is it a weapon or is it not a weapon, right? What are we looking for? Like if you're going to say, okay, this is a weapon, what are we looking for and how far are they from something like that? I mean, what does this tell us about where they're going with their technology? Can you look for any signs whether this is something that they're aiming? I'm sorry, bad verb. That they're using to develop a weapons capability, or I'm just curious if you could extend your analysis a bit more about what their intentions are and what their capabilities are now.
Yeah, well, basically, you can use everything as a weapon. You could even assume that French or, say, the European Union uses an Ariane 5 satellite launcher as a carrier vehicle. Basically, this is possible. It's just about the guidance system. You do some adjustments and it flies a different course. The thing is, you want to hit something with that vehicle. And if you want to hit something, this is a delivery system. You want something delivered to a certain point. And this is not that easy. You have quite a huge margin with a satellite launcher, even though you have to be quite precise, but the satellite usually can do the slight corrections, injection into orbit, and if you miss the orbit by a few kilometers, it's not a big deal. For a weapon, one important thing is you have to have a very precise cutoff. Imagine for a long-range rocket that travels with, say, 5 or 6 kilometers per second. If you make a mistake in shutting off the engines, that's only in the range of a few milliseconds. You add that to this speed, and if it flies for half an hour, you can calculate that you will miss, with that little error, you will miss the target by a few kilometers. So that's one big thing, one big deal about weapons. What's even more important is the payload itself. If you have something like a nuclear payload, the old payloads, the old first generation Soviet weapons, also the first generation US weapons, they were quite sensible. They were temperature sensitive. They were very, very fragile things. And you have to deliver them intact, and you have to have them trigger at exactly the right moment. If that thing comes down with several kilometers per hour, and it triggers just a few milliseconds too late, it will be down in the basement or even below that before it triggers. So it's kind of a difficult thing. You also have to make the thermal loads have to be within the right thing. You have to have thermal protection systems in place for a warhead like that. It's quite a complicated mechanism. So if you just want to hit a city with a missile or with a rocket, you can easily do that at once. But if you want to fight a war where you have several targets predetermined and that you really want to hit the enemy at these locations, you will have to change your rocket toward the missile thing. You have to have different guidance, a precise cutoff mechanism, a re-entry vehicle that works, a trigger that works, things like that. And as long as we don't see any attempts in North Korea to create that, we still have some time. They can always do something like a terror attack, but a weaponized system would be a different program.
If I could point out, a terror attack is, I think, in part what we're talking about. That is typically the mode of a nuclear attack, at least early in the nuclear era. Now, precision-guided weapons are a very different issue, but for a basic deterrent, perhaps we shouldn't ask too much of them. Next question? Yes, sir.
Peter Hayes. I just want to make a quick comment on that last point about the laws of physics operate in North Korean rocketry as well as they do in the rest of the world. And it's a question of systems engineering, essentially. Your modern missile has a very large number of parts. Take your car and multiply it by 20, basically, and you've got a modern missile. The essential components are the rocket, the re-entry vehicle, the guidance system, the fusing, and the warhead. Every one of those has to work. It's a chain. Any one of them doesn't work, the whole system doesn't work. Rocket, give it 1 out of 5 success rate. That's relatively empirical, albeit spread out over time. There have been more tests recently, but give it 20%. Re-entry vehicles, we really don't know. As far as we know, they haven't done any tests of re-entry vehicles that would relate to long-range missiles. They do have re-entry vehicles for the short and medium-range missiles. They could use a very blunt re-entry vehicle to slow it down, overcome some of the problems of ablation, heating, etc. But let's just guess. Let's just give it a 50% chance of working. Guidance system, again, we don't know. There's no indication that they know because their past tests have been to points in the ocean. Sometimes they have a buoy or a buoy out in the ocean, sometimes they don't. But unless you have an instrumented target site in the ocean, as we do, and the Russians, or the former Soviet Union has had, in the case of its Kamchatka target site for its tests, they don't know either how accurate their missiles are, or their missile tests. But let's, again, just guess, give it 50%. Fusing, they don't know if these warheads will work under the stresses that have been talked about of a re-entering long-range missile and re-entry vehicle. Guess, give it 50%. Warhead, well, we have some data. We have 1 out of 3 very large weapons in a static underground hole blowing up, so give it 30%. Multiply it through. I think you'll come up with less than 1% reliability. Now, our standard in the United States, and that's a gold-plated standard, is that after roughly 40 operational tests that work, we expect to have in a serial produced, not a batch or artisanal production line, about an 80% reliability in that overall chain. That means 80%, 80 reliability in the overall system of the missile. And that means that each of those components have to have roughly a 98% reliability to work at an 80% delivery reliability against a target.
Peter, could you?
Sure. So, short version, to hit a target at the moment, the North Koreans have to fire at those assumptions 120 missiles to hit one target, 120 warheads. And if you fired 120 warheads at one target, you'd have fratricide. So you'd have to fire more missiles and more warheads to be sure that your incoming exploding warheads didn't destroy some of the other ones that you've just fired at that. It's absurd. It's completely absurd. They don't have an operational missile, and they won't for many years. I've personally inspected, as many of you know, their power systems, their tractors, which are made one at a time at this point, their naval vessels, the Hanghung petrochemical plant. The way they do things is improvised. A single team, one leader, at speed, and they plan to fail and then recover. And you can't actually run a long-range missile program and plan to fail and recover, because you die in a war if you plan to fail. You don't recover. You get killed. And so I don't think actually that they imported a Chinese model. I just think this is their industrial and engineering culture, which is as strong in the military as it is in the industrial sector. And I'll finish just by one note of history. The relevant history, in my view, Joel referred to our knowledge at Nautilus of the history. The most relevant history is actually the August 1976 crisis. In August 1976, the United States advanced tactical nuclear weapons towards the demilitarized zone and pre-authorized the then commander-in-chief to bombard a North Korean barracks if the North Koreans responded to our tree-cutting team. I think it was August 30th, 1976. They actually fired on the helicopter that was over that operation, and we came very close to war and nuclear war at that time. The North Koreans remember that event. It's imprinted on their brain, and I think that we really need to think hard about how to stabilize the situation. As Joel was pointing out, we've got to get back to talking.
I think we are out of time. I would like to thank my fellow panelists, thank the Asan Institute, and everyone for attending.